I'm Abby Sharp, and I'm a registered dietitian on a mission to dismantle diet culture. Yes, that insidious multi-billion-dollar business keeping us on a never-ending hamster wheel of hating our bodies, fearing food, and spending our hard-earned money on a seemingly impossible mission to live our best, or more accurately, thinnest lives. On my new podcast, Bite Back with Abby Sharp, I'll be using my signature science and sass to debunk myths, call out the charlatans, and take down the endless barrage of BS bombarding us every day. Tune in each week as I'm joined by guests for expert interviews, engaging conversations, and science-backed information to help you leave diet culture behind for good. Listen on the Frequency Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
As Americans vote today, the entire world is watching to see if Donald Trump can somehow return to the White House. And aside from Americans, there are millions of people around the world holding their breath at the thought of what a Trump presidency means for their country. Perhaps none more so than Ukrainians. In 2 weeks, we will mark 1,000 days since Russia invaded Ukraine and since Ukrainians resisted so fiercely. But the situation now on the ground reportedly is dire for the defenders. And one of the two choices for U.S. President has vowed to settle the conflict, a term many believe to mean attempting to force Ukraine to accept a deal that would give large chunks of that country to Russia.
I will prevent, and very easily, World War III, very easily. Before I even arrive at the Oval Office, I will have the disastrous war between Russia and Ukraine settled. It will be settled quickly.
Now, 1,000 days is a long time. And it is difficult for any so-called regional conflict to stay in the eyes of the world consistently for that long, especially when the news cycle moves so quickly and effortlessly to the next conflict or the next disaster. So what does today's election mean for the future of Ukraine as a country? What is happening on the ground right now while the eyes of the world are elsewhere? Does Ukraine still have hope of a victory? And critically for all of us, is this about to become more than just a regional conflict? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Dr. Balkan Devlen is the director of the Transatlantic program and senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He is also an expert forecaster for Good Judgment Incorporated. He is one of the people we rely on to parse out how world events impact the future. Hey, Balkan.
Hello, Jordan. It's great to be back.
Why don't you start by telling us, obviously, tonight is the American election. How critical is what happens in the States over the next 48 hours, week or so, to the future of Ukraine?
It's a great question. And although I think in the short term, it may have drastic consequences, in the medium to long term, I think the primary determinant of how the war in Ukraine ends, whether it will end in Ukrainian victory or a forced settlement that benefits Russia, will fundamentally come down to whether our European allies managing to step up to the plate and continue to defend Europe against Russian onslaught, regardless of what happens in the U.S. elections. But of course, there is a serious concern and a variety of opinion, both in Europe as well as in Ukraine, when it comes to the election results. What it means if Donald Trump wins, what it means if Kamala Harris wins. And you will be surprised to perhaps to hear that there is no one single opinion in terms of which one would be more beneficial for Ukraine and Ukraine's war effort.
Can you maybe explain for us at least what we know based on what they've said? What would differ between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris in their approach to the conflict, should either one of them win?
So Harris' campaign basically continues the Biden's line when it comes to supporting Ukraine, though their language shifts between, as long as it takes to whatever it takes. But the policies themselves, I would expect a continuation in terms of providing support for Ukraine. However, it also comes together with the problems of Biden's approach, which is incrementalist, risk-averse, very much concerned with escalation and escalation management, and engaging in a drip support for Ukraine, an issue that we have talked about a few times here on this podcast. So on paper and on action, the rhetoric is there that it will continue Biden's policies. On the Trump side of things, you end up getting different signals. You, on the one hand, people like J.D. Vance, who basically comes out as pretty anti-Ukrainian, I would say, in terms of whether the support would continue. Trump himself claims that he will be able to reach a deal and stop the war. And if Vladimir Putin doesn't listen to him, he will go in full in, which I find not necessarily very believable. So the line, though, coming from the Trump surrogates, and depending on who you talk to, you also have the line saying that no. Trump administration will not necessarily throw Ukraine under the bus. That will be a position of negotiating from strength, etc. But then you look at what Trump himself says, and on these issues, he's all over. And I would not be too surprised that if he would try to enforce some sort of a deal, I don't think he will be able to succeed in either case. But it is a concern, particularly for the European allies and our Ukrainian friends, that they might be forced through a Trump administration into the negotiating table through the threat of holding back support. And I think that's a very legitimate concern at this stage.
Leaving aside the American election and sort of talk of the future for a few minutes, how are Ukrainian troops holding up on the ground right now? What is happening? Are they pushing forward? Are they struggling to maintain their current positions? Give us a sense of what's actually going on.
So the situation in the battlefield is not looking particularly good for Ukraine. The Russians have been incrementally advancing over the past few months in Donbass, taking different strategically located towns. The ammunition is coming through, but not on sufficient scale. The mobilization initially in Ukraine provided more troops, but there is still now issues with mobilizing more personnel. And of course, Ukrainians are naturally reluctant to ramp up that particular mobilization if the ammunition and the artillery shells and the weapons will not be there. Why would you send your people to the meat grinder as it goes? There is increasing frustration, and rightfully so, on the Ukrainian side, that they are fighting with their hands tied to their backs when it comes to striking deeper into Russian territory in order to inflict more damage and having to bring the war to the Russian supply and logistics. But the situation in the battlefield does not look good. I mean, the strikes against civilian infrastructure and cities are increasing. It's probably highest in terms of about drone and missile strikes and gliding bombs. Definitely larger numbers are coming through than it was the case in the past year and a half or two. So the situation, when you talk with the people on the ground and with people who are more familiar with the battle lines than I am, looks quite dire. Now, it doesn't mean that the Ukrainian front lines is about to collapse and the Russians will push through to another blitzkrieg to Kiev. That doesn't mean that, but it is a very, very difficult time, and a difficult time coming up in winter with increasing strikes and Russians hunting civilians in Kherson using, engaging literally what the Russians would call safaris, hunting civilian population through drones, for example. So the situation both in the cities, on the civilian side, as well as in the battlefield, is not particularly good.
You mentioned that Ukraine is having problems being allowed to use some of this equipment to strike deep into Russia. What happened to Ukraine's summer offensive, as I remember it? And they managed to take several small towns, sort of getting closer and closer into Russian territory. Are they still holding that? What's the state of any kind of incursion on that side?
If you mean the Kursk, infiltration into the Russian territory, from what I can follow, it is still holding, though you do have efforts by the Russians to take that part back. However, the Russians seem to focus their attacks and firepower and attention into Donbass and trying to break the lines there and capture the rest of Donbass that they are not controlling right now. So the situation on the ground is as such that although there are some tactical level successes that comes with the incursion of Ukrainian troops into Russia in the Kursk region, they're not necessarily strategically making the impact that Ukraine was hoping that it will. That is, distract Russian and divert Russian resources away from the offensive in Donbass and towards Kursk, and that did not happen.
Céline Dion.
My dream, to be international star.
Could it happen again? Could Celine Dion happen again?
I'm Thomas Leblanc, and Celine Understood is a 4-part series from CBC Podcasts and CBC News, where I piece together the surprising circumstances that helped manufacture Celine Dion, the pop icon. Celine Understood, available wherever you get your podcasts.
In the meantime, there have also been reports that apparently have a number of allies concerned of North Korean troops reporting to Russia. What do we actually know about this situation, and why would that be so concerning?
I mean, there are at least three things that should concern us. Now, the numbers change, but it ranges anywhere from 3,000 to 12,000 troops in total. By some accounts coming from intelligence sources that are reported in the media, there are already 3,000 North Korean troops that are brought forward and being trained and transported to the front. Now, whether they will remain in Russia or whether they will be used as combat troops in Ukraine remains to be seen. At this stage, there were some photographs coming out that North Korean troops being killed in Kursk in Russia as a part of that operation. So a couple of things are clear there. They are not just technical support engineers, etc., that would provide support for the North Korean ammunitions and ballistic missiles and other things that North Korea has been providing to Russia, but actual combat troops that will be used. So they're fundamentally North Korean mercenaries that is provided by the North Korean regime. Now, it is concerning because not only because the North Korea have a relatively vast, sort of reservoir of troops that they can provide, which will reduce the political pressures on Vladimir Putin in terms of mobilization and diverting more resources for the war effort, which already puts strain on the Russian economy, Russian production outside the war effort, etc. So this will provide some sort of a reprieve as well as political, less costly domestically. But also, on the other side of it, it also provides North Korea, ability to test their military, test their weapons. And this concerns, of course, our South Korean allies, clearly, as well as what Russians are providing in return. Advanced technology in terms of ballistic missiles, higher, better sensing equipment, and support, intelligence support for their nuclear program. What is being provided in return for not only roughly 3 million shells that North Korea provided to Russia this year, which is the amount equal to Russians themselves producing, but also now troops. So this is basically North Korea helping Russia invade a European country. And now we will have the troops fighting there. So it has, I think, important ramifications, both war in Ukraine, but also peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula.
When I was putting my notes together for this interview, I was checking to see how long this conflict had been going on for. 2 weeks from today, when this is airing, it will hit its 1,000th day. Is it surprising to you to see this conflict drag on for so long, to see Ukraine being able to hold out for this long, or even Russia's refusal to back down as they've kind of continually been turned away?
To me, unfortunately, it is not surprising. And it is in your show, I think back in April 2022, when we talked about this, I said that we shouldn't think about this war as the first Gulf War, like a 6 weeks war, but we should think about Iran-Iraq war that lasted 8 years. And given that the Ukrainians managed to stop the blitzkrieg to Kiev in the initial weeks and months of the war, I was expecting this to go on for a while, and unfortunately, this remains the case. And there are multiple reasons for it. The primary reason is, of course, Ukrainians' courage and bravery in terms of defending their home and hearth, but also after weeks of dithering, the Western support and ammunition coming through, enabling Ukrainians to defend, and Russia making a big miscalculation in terms of how fast they can move and what is the support that they thought they had in eastern Ukraine, which of course was mostly a fiction. So yes, unfortunately, I'm not surprised. This is also in line with historical war development. As we talked before, wars tend to last most wars last few days to few weeks. A few of them that goes beyond those timelines tend to last years. So it's a bimodal distribution mostly. And we're already beyond that. So I am expecting this war, unfortunately, in some form or another to go in another 12, 18, 24 months before we can see the end of the tunnel. And again, at one calculation, this war has been going on for 10 years. If you go back to 2014 and the annexation of Crimea and invasion of eastern Ukraine. So we are already in a multi-year, perhaps a multi-decade war in Europe. And we will remain in that position regardless of whether there will be a temporary pause in this particular phase of the conflict soon.
One of the things that Trump and his surrogates have said a lot in relation to Ukraine is that there's no point continuing to give them so much money because they can't win this war. Is there a path to victory for Ukraine, assuming perhaps a Harris administration, that would actually not keep this conflict going on for another 2-3 years? Like, is that opportunity still on the table, I guess?
I think there is. It is a narrow path, but it exists. And that window of opportunity might end up closing soon enough for two reasons. One, despite the massive resources that Russia, bring to bear on this conflict, including support from North Korea and China and Iran, their resources are not unlimited. And those who are supporting Russia would have their own red lines, would have their own calculations to what extent they are willing to provide military support, financial support by buying Russian resources, etc. And there is a limit in which you can transform your economy into a war economy and continue to shield the vast majority of the public from the effects, economic and social effects of that war. So there is a limit to how long Russia can also continue this war. When you look at on the other side, the second thing is that the West, Europe is 10 times larger than the Russian economy in terms of capacity. If you include, United States, Canada, Japan, South Korea, we're talking about 20 times larger in terms of the capacity to do things. What we are lacking is the political will. So we do have a pathway, and that pathway goes through lifting restrictions on Ukraine's ability to strike everywhere, all the legitimate military targets in Russia, providing them with everything they need at a scale that they need, not drip, 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 providing the support too little, too late, giving the Russians an opportunity to adjust. And the fundamental thing, and this is a brutal truth, and it's not nice to hear, but the road to a Ukrainian victory goes through providing Ukrainians the ability to kill as many Russian troops as possible while destroying as much of Russian equipment, weapons, and ammunition as possible so that it changes the calculation in Kremlin. When Putin decides that the costs are too high domestically, internationally, this war will end, and we can help Ukraine get there. But that requires a proper rearmament of the West for our defense and for Ukraine's defense. As I have been saying for years, this is not charity. This is self-interest for us. We need to be able to realize that we are at war, whether we like it or not, because that's how Kremlin thinks. This is not, in Putin's mind, only a war in Ukraine against Ukraine, but this is a war against the West. We're still trying to pursue it through the times of policies of peacetime. We need to ramp up, and if we do bring bear our economic might and our ability to outproduce Russia in this war, there is a pathway to victory. It's not easy, but the not acting, the cost of inaction and dithering is a lot higher than whatever the short-term costs of ramping up our defense production and giving Ukraine what it needs.
Well, the last thing that I want to ask you about is, and I think you kind of just alluded to it there, is what is the biggest concern here beyond the U.S. election and continued support for Ukraine? Is this that we're in a larger conflict than we actually believe we are in now? What will you be watching for in the next little while, regardless of who wins the election?
Regardless of who wins the election, what I am very much concerned is the continuing political instability in the United States with a deadlocked government, rival claims to who won the election, and increasing polarization in the United States that makes American public and the politicians turn even more inward, and therefore providing more space, creating a vacuum in the international system for our adversaries to step up and fill in. This not only includes Russia, but also China and Iran and others. As the United States increasingly deal with the consequences of a domestic polarization and a deadlock system and rival claims to a contested election, if that comes to pass, that will provide the opportunity for others to push forward. And neither Canada nor, unfortunately, our European allies are at this stage ready to fill that void. I think Europeans are waking up, but not fast enough. There are still concerns when it comes to Germany and other Western European countries that they do not understand the reality of the situation. And here at home, unfortunately, we seem to lack any sense of urgency on how and why this matters to us and the world change. So I am concerned about this inward-looking, navel-gazing attitude that would give no bandwidth for the policymakers in the West to deal with an increasing threat of a much broader conflict around the world, and our adversaries are taking advantage of that. That is my primary concern right now.
Balkan, as always, thank you so much for your time and for walking us through this. And I think, the eyes of the world have been elsewhere for a while, but it's good to learn what's at risk right now.
Well, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be in the show.
Balkan Devlen of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and Good Judgment Incorporated. That was The Big Story. For more from us, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can always shoot us some feedback by emailing hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by calling us and leaving a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find The Big Story in your favorite podcast player and, of course, on your smart speaker when you ask it to play The Big Story podcast. If you ever feel like leaving us a rating or a review in any of those podcast players, we see them all. They are always appreciated. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.
Céline Dion.
My dream, to be international star.
Could it happen again? Could Celine Dion happen again?
I'm Thomas Leblanc, and Celine Understood is a 4-part series from CBC Podcasts and CBC News, where I piece together the surprising circumstances that helped manufacture Celine Dion, the pop icon. Celine Understood. Available wherever you get your podcasts.